Welcome to Must Reads, a series of brief interviews with authors of new books in the field of homiletics. I'm Alice McKenzie, and I'm the director of the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence at SMU that sponsors this series of books. And today we have the pleasure of having with us the Reverend Dr. Luke Powery. Luke is the Dean of the Chapel at Duke University, and he is also professor of homiletics at the Divinity School at Duke. And you also serve at the university's African American Studies faculty, I believe.
That's right.
He has a lot of hats. So thank you for taking time to talk with us today. I have been a big fan of yours over the years. I've used your work in my own reflection and preaching and in the classroom. So just a shout out to listeners, after this interview, search out some of Dr. Powery's earlier works on putting lament and celebration together, and on the spirituals as a source of hope in the crucible of suffering. But, you know, we got to take one book at a time. So today we're here to talk about your new book, which is called Becoming Human, the Holy Spirit and the Rhetoric of Race. And in that book, if I'm reading it rightly, you do your kind of signature standing at the intersection of Holy Spirit, culture, and preaching and worship. And you offer us a kind of antidote to what you call racialization. So I thought that might be a good place to start. What is racialization as you present it in the book?
Sure. Thanks so much, Alice, for having me on here. I'm a big fan of yours too for many years. Racialization, I use that term as much as possible throughout the book, as opposed to just saying race, because race, just saying race would make it seem as if it's an ontological thing. Right. And race is a social construct. It's a social reality, but it's not biologically real, which is what I say in chapter 2. But racialization is the means by which people groups have been raced, have been deemed less than human, have been usually at the lower level of a human hierarchy based on color. And historically at the bottom have been Black people. And so racialization is something, it implies that something that is done to you to dehumanize you. And so this is sort of stretches all the way back to the history of colonialism, and this kind of ideal, really an ideal, of a European ideal of features, of looks, etc. Right. And people have been racialized as a means for power and control, and therefore often dehumanized, and often at the worst not seen as a human being. And so I try to wrestle with that and talk about how that history of racialization even continues, in our time. Right.
Well, I got that point very strongly, that it's not a biological reality. It's a social construct that comes through loud and clear. And, you talk about how to be raced is to be erased.
That's right.
And I love the way you talk about then the Holy Spirit moves us from being erased to embraced.
Yeah, that's good.
So could you, well, that's from you. I'm quoting you, and it is good. So what would you say then? I love the way that you bring in then pneumatology, which you say has been neglected, and bring that in with Acts 2 and talk about the gifts of Pentecost, the gift of the Holy Spirit, into this cultural mess of racialization.
For sure. I mean, for me, there's been a gap in the conversation of the literature on race and theology. There's been a pneumatological hole. So that's one contribution. But I think for me specifically, to imagine the history of racialization dehumanizes other people, has in particular deemed bodies, human bodies, as nobodies. And what we find at Pentecost is really this embrace of diversity and particularity. Particularity is not erased. Language, culture, bodies, tongues, and human beings are a vessel, so to speak, or a kind of pneumatological kenosis, a self-emptying of the spirit in human beings, which to me is a deep affirmation of humanity, as opposed to the de-affirmation that has happened historically in this history of racialization. And so this pneumatological move is really a theological way of thinking, of exploring what it means to affirm all human beings. Particularly in this book, obviously, I'm focusing on sort of Black history and how those who have been deemed Black have been deemed non-human. And so through the work of the Spirit, there's a kind of rehumanization, though from dehumanization, but in the work of the Spirit works to rehumanize those who have been discarded. And I find it beautiful, even in Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, in the scene of the clearing, there's a preacher, Baby Suggs, who tells the enslaved to love their flesh because out yonder they don't love it. Love your tongues, your arms, your liver, etc. But the theologian Sean Copeland calls that scene a liturgy of the Spirit. And it connects so well with this understanding that in the Spirit and through the work, the Spirit of Pentecost, there is a deep embrace of human bodies in our particularity, regardless of what society or history has said. So to me, it was also a call, I would say, the Pentecost to the church to say, we need to find a new tongue, a new way of speaking about these kinds of issues in the church, because by just saying race all the time, we're reifying a social construct as if it's a thing. I mean, Toni Morrison, in one of her final lectures, the Norton Lectures, which became that book, The Origin of Others, talks about how there is just one race, the human race. And so scientific studies now show that we're really so much alike, more alike than different genetically. And so what does that mean then theologically for how we think about one another, engage one another, talk? What's the tongues we use to speak about one another and these kinds of these struggles in the church? Pneumatology is my pathway for thinking about that.
I have noticed you're obsessed with the Holy Spirit.
No, what's wrong with me?
What's right with you? Well, the whole notion that breath has no color and breath is universal. So moving into, I think it was chapter 2, you talk about a homiletic for humanity. And I noticed that you focused in there quite a bit on, how we like to teach these sermon forms, right?
Yeah.
You start here, you go here, you end here, and it can become helpful, but it can become kind of tidy. And I was interested in your emphasis in that regard about form. Could you just say a word about that?
Yeah. It's funny because when you engage pneumatology, it's like an expansion. It happens in life, and you can't just think about my little tidy sermon form on a page. When you think about preaching in the Spirit, which I can't help but think about life in the Spirit, or I can't help think about beyond a form that is just on a page, a narrative form or 3 points in a sermon or in a hymn. For me, the engaging pneumatology around homiletics opens it up to thinking about the human life or the body as a part of this sermon form. And what I think I've been challenged with in kind of just opening up this conversation, because when we think about engaging pneumatology for homiletics, I think often the typical ways of talking about sermon forms are too limiting. If we're talking about pneumatology, it has to be broader. So our bodies, our lives, and particularly if we think about Christ, the incarnation of Jesus, Philippians 2, that the particular form that Jesus takes on is a human form, which is significant, but then it's the form of a slave. So what does it mean
Hmm.
that we proclaim this Jesus, follow this Jesus, whose particular human shape or form was the form of a slave? What might that even mean for our preaching?
Hmm.
And as we think about sermon forms, like we have to, I think it pushes us to go beyond the typical, to
Mhm.
think about, which we've seen in performance studies and, the voice, the body, enfleshment, and so the spirit, breath, even has us to sort of break out of these categories. I mean, I think Chuck Campbell's work on the grotesque is kind of, you know, influencing my
Yeah.
thinking. The
Yeah.
spirit is that way as well, because Pentecost, power came on people, dunamis, dynamite. It's explosive, it's expansive. They witness to the ends of the earth. So even our forms need to be expanded on how we think about this. And something like dynamite could actually occur, perhaps,
Right.
to
Yeah.
if we really sort of invite the spirit into how we think about preaching and actually preach. Something new may be formed.
Right.
And I think, hopefully we're transformed and not malformed along the way. But that's some of what I would say. I've just been stretched and challenged and wondering how we teach about the human form
Right.
in our conversation about sermon forms, because we would, Augustine and others, right? Your life is an eloquent speech.
Right.
And I think it presses us in homiletics to really begin to think maybe more holistically in a greater way.
Mm-hmm. So you're unifying pneumatology, incarnational theology. You're sort of taking your life is your sermon and dialing it up to the nth degree.
Most definitely.
Yeah, for sure. So
And if we preach Jesus, what does it mean if the Christ event and his particular event took on a human form, but the form of a slave,
yeah.
right? The suffering body. What does that really mean for
Mm-hmm.
our forms and for what we do as
For
preachers?
honoring one another in a radical way, for
Yeah.
sure, for sure. Well, we could talk on, and I wish we could, but I will. Is this backwards? Wait, that's not showing up, is it? That's not
No,
working. All right. Well, let me tell them the name of the title. Here we go. Becoming
there you
Human.
go. There you
Okay,
go.
there you go. Becoming Human. The Holy Spirit. Wasn't that was very suave, wasn't it? The Becoming Human, the Holy Spirit, and the Rhetoric of Race, published in 2022 by Westminster John Knox Press. So it needs to be on your shelves, you preachers, and stay tuned for future episodes of Must Reads. And thank you so much, Dr. Powery, for your scholarship, for your witness, and for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.